This is the review you've all been waiting for. Today we review the Cotic Solaris MAX. Today I'm reviewing the Cotic Solaris MAX frame. I'm very excited to bring this to you. Sorry it took so long. This bike has taken a long time to get used to. It doesn't feel like any other hardtail, and I haven't been able to just hop on it and in a ride or two know what it's about. It's really taken me a while to get used to it. And now that I'm used to it, I'd like to share my thoughts on it with you. A lot of people are wondering how this compares to the Cotic Beefy Max. It climbs just like it, and that's a good thing. These are both fantastic climbers, whether it's technical or slow and spinny. The geometry isn't radically different between them. I'm running a 120mm fork on here, 66-degree head angle. They both have 444 chain stays, which is a lot longer than what I'm used to. But man, they tractor up stuff, that's for sure. Here we are on hard climb number 1. This is really hard. It's way steeper than it looks. And all these are momentum stoppers. So you can get going and then it wants to stop you and you got to push through it. I can usually get this with a couple tries. Let's see how the Solaris MAX does on this. It's interesting. I'm used to leaning forward on short wheelbases and still having traction in the back. With the long wheelbase, you lean too far forward, it spins because there's no weight on it back there. So I've had to adapt my riding style to stay back more on steep climbs, and that's hard for me. Woohoo! That was a tricky climb, and I'm still getting used to this bike. Part of it's the long wheelbase. Part of it's just kind of how it handles and steers. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Let's continue on. Cotic markets this as their do everything hardtail, from marathon XC races to bike packing to enduro and crazy stuff. And that's a big claim to make. If I picked up this bike and nobody told me its intended purpose, I think it's a low travel enduro bike. It definitely rides like one. I've got it set up pretty heavy with some strong aggressive parts on it, so it rides like a sturdy aggressive bike right now because of the parts on it. But you could definitely make this lightweight. Let's talk ride quality. This bike feels surprisingly different than the Beefy Max. Just a sec. This frame is noticeably more supple and comfortable than the Beefy Max. The Beefy Max has a little more zing to it. Accelerates with a little more energy. Yeah, I can't get too far over the front or the back wheel spins. But when you're seated, that means you've always got traction back there in the front. Doesn't want to lift a whole lot. Just takes a little bit of adjusting your technique. It's a great climber though. Does great on all these 2-foot step ups. So you just wheelie up it and keep your momentum and get right up it. This is the waterfall below Chicken Point and White Line. I've never made it up this, but I've never tried it with clipless pedals either. So today we're clipless. Hard to tell on the GoPro, but this is a good 18-inch lip. And then up to there is waist height. I can get up to here, but then you're kind of in a hole and it's really hard to get up that step. So if you can get over here, I've seen guys make it that way. But when you're there, your back wheel's kind of in this loose stuff down here, and it's really hard to gain traction. No! It gets so steep here, I wasn't ready for that. We gave it a good go. Well, that just goes to show no matter how good the geometry on the bike, you still need a fair amount of skill to climb obstacles like this, and I don't have it yet. It's a good goal. I'm gonna come back and get it. I gotta clean this before I go try bottoms out anymore. One thing about this bike, same with the Beefy Max, the stack is quite low, especially on a 120 mil bike. If you had a 140 fork, your stack would be 20 mil higher, and you'd notice that. Honestly, I think the bike does fine with a 120 fork though. It's pretty fun having, you know, using every millimeter of that fork on every ride. And the helm is a great match for this bike. They've done an interesting thing with their long shot geometry, they call it. Their goal is to have the bars behind the fork crown. And it's an odd feeling, and it takes some getting used to. That's the real reason it's taken me 5 rides to get used to this bike. It steers pretty different. If this were my bike, I'd run a 40 or 50 mil riser bar and possibly a little bit longer stem. So one difference between this and the Beefy Max that I reviewed, this is a size medium, and the Beefy Max was a small. And this is a long medium at 460 mil reach. So I'm pretty stretched out, but I feel it's a good size for the chainstays. I never like it when my reach is shorter than my chainstays. It just feels unbalanced. So despite this being, feels like it's a mile longer, and it is longer, I do like the proportion and how your weight distribution is. That's why I think taller riders should ride longer chainstays than shorter riders. This bike though, because it's so long, it's super stable. I never feel like I'm going over the bars. Got a long wheelbase, slack head angle, and that short stem. The shorter stems make bikes a little bit twitchier to steer. It also pulls your weight back more. So on a shorter stem, you don't have quite as much weight on the front. That's why I consider stem length more than just bike fitment, but body position on the bike and how it weights the bike. A longer stem will transfer more of your weight forward onto the front wheel. And with bikes getting longer and longer, you got to get over the front more. If you haven't seen my video on how we should change our technique to match modern geometry, check that out. So this bike for my size is not playful. That super long rear end makes it hard for me to wheelie and bunny hop and manual and stuff. Taller people are fine. I've had taller buddies on it and they can manual and wheelie just fine, but it's hard for me being a shorter guy. Whew. Oh man, look at this place. So the big question everyone's wondering is, how does this ride compare to the Beefy Max? They're both made by Cotic. Well, this has a front triangle that's Reynolds 853. The Beefy Max just had an 853 down tube. I don't know if that's the main difference, but this bike is noticeably more supple. The Beefy Max was sharper to accelerate, a little bit stiffer in a good way. This isn't noodly, but it lacks the burst of speed that you get on the Beefy Max, but this is more comfortable. So for long days in the saddle, if you want more comfort, I recommend the Solaris MAX. If you want a stiffer, more precise ride, the Beefy Max is stiffer and more precise. And also, this is a size medium. That was a size small, so they're not apples to apples comparison. They feel very similar though. Bottom bracket feels the same between the two. This has a low bottom bracket, which I love, but if you're sloppy with your pedals and you don't know how to time them well, you're going to have a lot of pedal strikes. But I haven't had a single pedal strike with this yet because I'm used to timing them out here with all our rocks. The head angle feels even slacker than it is. If I were blindfolded and somebody told me this was a 64-degree head angle, I'd believe it. Part of it's that long shot geometry, part of it's that super short stem. It just steers different, and this bike wants to steer with the bars straight, where you steer with your feet. You don't steer by turning the bars like an XC bike. You turn like you're skiing and you carve corners with your feet. If you don't know how to do that yet, you might struggle to get on with this bike, because you're going to be steering from the top with the bars, and it doesn't want to do that. It wants to steer and corner like a downhill bike, and it will really reward people who have great technique. The long chainstay coupled with the long front end makes for a very balanced bike, but I don't think I'd recommend this or the Beefy Max in a size small. The front end's just a little too short compared to the back end. But this bike is very futuristic. In my video where I talk about the future of hardtails, I say I think hardtails are going to get slacker with less travel, and that's exactly what this is. 120 mil travel, 66 head angle that feels like 64. This happens to have a long chainstay, which, like I said, will be great for tall riders. I wouldn't recommend it for people under 5'7", unless you're wanting to stay glued to the ground. If I were racing enduro, this would be my #1 choice. It just wants to stay on the ground and track. It plows extremely well. I think with a 140 fork, you'd be able to get even a little bit rowdier. But to be honest, I think the sweet spot for hardtails, even aggressive hardtails like this, is 130 travel and maybe 120, how I've got it set up here. Yes, I use all the travel, but with less travel, your geometry isn't changing so much. Remember that every time you hit a bump, the whole bike pivots on the rear axle and everything gets lower on the front. So your head angle is changing as you hit bumps. And the less that moves, the fewer the changes are. So if that was a 160 fork, you go from 160 to bottom out, that's going to get 8 degrees steeper. You do a 120, it's only going to get 6 degrees steeper. I mean, yeah, it's only 2 degrees different, but you feel it because this stays in its main travel range. It stays in the same place more, whereas a 160 fork is moving around quite a bit, and it is changing the geometry, and you can feel that. I love the big triangle. I love being able to fit 2 water bottles inside the cage. That's super cool. I like that you can slam the seat all the way. I like that they kept the seat post short. I have really short legs, but I can run a 150 and they're slammed all the way. I think the long chainstay is what makes this bike really want to rip on the downhills. It's so planted and it's so stable. I can't imagine going over the bars on this bike. When it gets steep, I just lean on the front and just lean on the front and on the nose, and it just plows down stuff. It does super well. And what's surprising is it's not just a plow bike. It's not poppy and playful for me because of the size of the chainstay. Longer chainstays, longer wheelbase makes it ride more like a hill climber motorcycle, where that wheel's way back there. It doesn't want to wheelie out as much. It kind of feels like I'm towing a trailer a little bit. I mean, it's only 1.5 centimeters longer than most bikes, but you do feel that when you're short, especially. So I think tall people are going to love this bike. It's going to feel a lot better proportioned for a lot of them. So this bike will still jump well on manicured jumps, but when you're trying to pop off a little rock, I find the longer chainstays, the timing's a little different, and it's not quite as happy to get airborne as some other bikes like the Sage Flow Motion or a Chameleon or my RSD Middle Child. I don't find myself trying to hop into manuals everywhere. I can manual across cracks no problem and hop over logs, but my bunny hops are limited. My playfulness, I get fun out of this on charging stuff, not on popping around and playing around everything. And my attitude, I'm more of a goof around, pop around stuff, hop up stuff, see if I can get up that. So this bike isn't the best for that, but it's great for plowing down super hard stuff. I would take this on any trail I've taken any other hardtail. It's extremely planted, very modern, very aggressive. For me, I don't think it would be the perfect marathon long XC bike packing bike for me because of the size. I would need a small size if I was spending all day in the saddle, just because I'm a little bit stretched out. Stretched out is great on the steep downhills and even the steep climbs, But on flat stuff, I don't like being that stretched out over time. So I would size down, but then the back end would feel a little longer than I'd want. It definitely feels like this was designed by somebody super tall or for somebody super tall. And that's great because a lot of tall guys complain that no bikes fit them these days. I encourage you to give one of these a try. I'll bet it will fit you. All right, let's get some more ride impressions of this. I'll talk more about it as we're riding. All right, now we're gonna ride down the Broken Arrow Trail. It's got some steep sections, and that'll be nothing for this bike with that long front end and long rear end. This bike wants to charge big time. See if we can find some space to open her up and let her rip. Here's a big move. Super smooth and planted down that. This bike to me feels like an enduro race machine wolf in sheep's clothing. Don't let the 120 mil travel fool you. This thing flies and is so composed on fast downhills. 2-foot drop there, 2-foot drop there. That soft frame makes it ride a lot better, more in control, less harsh, doesn't beat you up as much. The longer wheelbase and longer chainstay is the most noticeable thing about this, along with the way it steers. It corners extremely well on long sweepers. On tight stuff, feels a little longer than I'm used to, but you can kind of scandy flick it around a little better because it's easier to unweight because it's so far back there. But linking corners, this thing is fun. So it can still get on the back wheel. It's just not as eager to as a short wheelbase bike. And if you got long legs, that doesn't matter because you can get behind it. Oh, this is fun though. Pretty chunky here. Yeah, this bike wants to race down stuff. Really fun. All right, let's get some speed here. Super planted, and you'll notice I keep the bars straight when I corner. I don't turn the bars. It's a nice quiet frame. I love the external cable routing. Really nicely built frame. This is what they mean when they say steel is real. This frame feels great. I'm riding faster on this bike than my other short wheelbase bikes because I'm not looking for stuff to pop off of. I'm just kind of straight lining everything. That's not to say this bike doesn't handle well, it does. I just can't make it dance like my other ones, so I've stopped looking for all the fun little stuff to pop off of. I do like this bike better than the beefy Max, I think, because I think 120, 130 travels just about right for a hardtail like this. And I don't think I'd ever run this Plus. I love Plus bikes. Hang on, I need to stop talking. I need concentration here. I love plus bikes, but it doesn't suit the attitude of this bike. This bike wants to go fast, and 29ers are faster than plus. Doesn't want to goof around. And it's not the head angle, it's the chainstay and the stack. Sedona doesn't have a whole bunch of super fast downhills. Most of our stuff's rolling with chunk and exposure, so you never get going quite super fast. So this wouldn't be my first choice for Sedona. It's doing fine, but I feel like it just wants to be opened up, and I'm never able to fully open it up. I do love how modern this bike is though, with that long reach and slack head angle. All right, I've never tried to go up this. It's a little bit, okay, it's a lot sketchy. There's a big side hill to the right. I'll make sure to fall left if I fall. Yeah. Cool, I've never done that before. This bike does give me a lot of confidence to try stuff. It's so planted. It's the opposite of twitchy. If the chainstay were shorter, I'd want a shorter reach. But for this long chainstay, this reach feels great. Whew. Now we're in the slow tech, the slow punchy moves of the hogs. And you'd think a long slack bike wouldn't balance very well on this stuff. It balances great. But you'll notice this whole video, my bars are almost always totally straight, unless I'm at a super sharp switchback. This bike steers by leaning more than turning at the bars. You don't want to turn like this on it. You want to turn like this, lean the bike. And that's a skill you kind of have to get used to on these modern bikes. Not everyone is used to that, so they ride them and think, oh, it just felt like dead steering. Doesn't feel dead to me. You just steer with your feet instead of your hands. I'm gonna do a video on that soon, on how to steer with your feet, because a lot of people still don't know what I'm talking about. Time to rate this bike. Climbing, I'm gonna give it a 10 out of 10. It doesn't climb. For that big waterfall I was trying, sometimes a longer wheelbase is better, sometimes a shorter is better. I think a shorter wheelbase is gonna help me on that, but who knows? It's more rider lack of skill than the bike problem that I didn't get up that. It's got a nice steep seat angle. That's one of the latest updates to this model. I don't feel like I'm over the back. I feel like this bike was really built with tall people in mind. Steeper seat angle, longer reaches, longer chainstay. You tall guys are gonna love this. A nice modern hardtail. Is it a marathon bike? Sure, you could do marathon rides on it, but something like a carbon epic is gonna weigh 3 pounds less just in the frame. That's not to say this is a heavy bike, but it's built to take abuse. This would be my first choice for a hardtail at Whistler, I think. It's just so planted, and that more compliant frame. Ride quality, this is more compliant than my Banshee Paradox. More compliant than the aluminum Chameleon. More compliant than my Thai Middle Child. More compliant than the Kona Hanzo by far. It's not as noodly as the Marin Pine Mountain 2. Not quite as soft as that bike. It's more compliant than the Beefy Max. There's really only one or two bikes I've ridden that are more compliant than this. This has got a really nice ride. Just takes the sting out of stuff. It's a little bit less precise on the rear end than the Beefy Max. That bike's got a really cool, sprightly, stiff, zippy feel. This one's a little more muted. Those two have more in common with each other than different. They're very similar bikes. But this one I like a little more. And for people my height, if you live in steep terrain with steep drops and stuff like this, guide size to the medium. If you're more comfortable on the small, I'd probably get something with the shorter chainstay. The companies from the UK, I've noticed, when they make a 29er, they make the chainstays pretty long, where a lot of other companies try to tuck those 29er chainstays as much as possible. That 444 and the short stem are very noticeable and will take considerable getting used to. Do not judge this bike on its first ride. Learn how to steer with the feet and it will reward you. And I already steered with my feet, but still took a long time to get used to. When I let my buddies ride it, they're in the same boat. So playfulness, I'm gonna give this bike a 4 out of 10 for my size. I refer to playfulness as how well the bike bunny hops, jumps, goofs around, makes you want to jib off of everything. It actually feels like this bike's kind of resisting it. If you're tall, you can make it dance a lot more. But when you have short legs, you can't get your hips far enough behind the rear axle to hold a manual very well. Even wheelies, I have to lift that front end so high, I can't hold them very long on this bike. And that low stack, that low front end, it kind of feels XC racy with the low front end. And it's planted, but it makes it harder to pop onto that back wheel, which, I mean, let's face it, that's the reason XC bikes have a low front end, is to keep the front end down, not to keep it up. So if you're on a large or extra large, I think you'll still find this quite playful if the stack's tall enough. I'll have to look at the charts to see how big the stack is. I definitely run riser bars on this bike to make it more playful. Downhill, I'm gonna give this a 10 out of 10. This is very, very stable downhill, and it just begs to be pushed downhill more and more and more. Downhill, this thing begs to be pushed, but it requires a modern bike position. You've got to get over the front, especially with that short stem. Look at how I'm steering with the bars totally straight. You lean the bike a lot, but you don't twist the bars. But that just shows how stable this thing is downhill. This bike with a 140 fork would be my enduro race bike of choice for sure. Where I'm trying to stay on the ground, just crush out the speed. It's still surprisingly willing to get up steppy stuff. So even though I say it's not playful, I can still get small wheelies and manuals in to get up and over features. So yeah, cornering, I'm gonna give it a 10 out of 10 too. corners like it's on rails if you're over the front. If you're scared and you lock your arms and get away from the front, you're gonna hate it. Yeah, cornering feels great. You do feel the long wheelbase on really tight switchbacks, but you adjust to it. But a long wheelbase makes a bike track extremely well. It makes sweeping corners feel like berms. You just kind of lock into the corner, and it has good balance between the front and rear. If you ever come to Sedona, be very careful of your speeds with all the hikers here. It'd be easy to hit a family. Yeah, this is one of the most supple bikes I've ridden. It's not noodly. It feels great. And coupled with these Zip 3.0 moto wheels, man, what a match. Bravo, Cotic, you've done a great job on this bike. A lot of people think all hardtails ride the same, or even all hardtails with similar geo charts ride the same. This bike rode totally different than what I expected looking at the geo chart. It feels more planted, feels slacker. It feels like more of a raced charger than I thought it would. Hardtails feel so different from bike to bike, and this one is noticeably different from almost every other bike I ride. So I hope this helps you decide if this bike is for you. That's why I do these reviews. So who's this bike for? This bike's for anyone who wants to know what a good steel frame feels like. Only about 10% of the steel frames I ride feel like this. The rest are too stiff. This bike's for someone who wants to stay connected to the ground and go fast, or who's tall. This would be a fantastic all-rounder trail bike for someone over 5'10". I think this bike rewards a steeper, more difficult place to ride. If you're in Northern California, sure, it'd still be fun, but you'll never even come close to reaching the potential of this bike because there's nothing there hard enough to really push this. I feel like the 120 fork was a good match if you're smooth, and if you have a good fork like this helm. You can dial this helm in to feel exactly how you want it to feel. I think most people would prefer a 130 fork on this. I don't feel like 140 would be better unless you were racing enduro on it, but for all-rounder, man, I'd probably keep 120 on this. Just throw some tall bars on. So is this bike for you? It can be. If you're short like me, I think the wheelbase is a little too long, the chain stays a little too long, the reach is a little too long, unless you're tackling really steep technical stuff. It's fun. I wouldn't want it as my only bike here because the trails just aren't steep enough and fast enough to really maximize that long chain state, and I like something more playful. If you're tall, I think it could be a great option. I don't know if it's the right marathon bike, mainly because I've got mine built up so heavy. If you built this up light and you like the lower front end, you might really like this bike. But it does feel more like an enduro bike than an XC marathon bike. It's a great all-rounder trail bike. This is what the future of hardtails are gonna be like, I think. Hopefully some with shorter chain stays, because I think shorter chain stays would make this pretty much the perfect trail bike for me because I'm so short. If you're wondering how this bike compares to some other bikes, or if you need help deciding if it's for you, I offer a bike consulting service through Patreon. It's one-on-one. You fill out a questionnaire. We work back and forth to help you find the perfect bike. If you know what you want and what you need, and you can read the geo tables and these reviews give you what you need, no need for that service. But if you have other questions like how does this compare to the Johnny Rotten, or how does this compare to the Middle Child, I save all of that for my paying patrons. I get a lot of bike requests every day and I can't handle those just doing them for free, so I have to charge for them on Patreon. If that's something you're interested in, head over to patreon.com/hardtailparty and check it out. I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons for making this channel possible. It's the reason I'm able to make these videos as often as I do. This is a fantastic bike if you want a long chainstay and a planted bike. It's probably my favorite long chainstay bike I've ever ridden. It is my favorite. And this would be my first choice for an enduro race bike or a bike where I wanted to go as fast as I possibly could. Hope you enjoyed that review. Thanks for watching. There's a party in the mountains and you're invited.